Russia's moral framework, particularly as it applies to contemporary Russian foreign policy, differs markedly from that of the West. While post-Soviet Russia has no guiding ideology, it does argue that certain values, if adopted as shared principles of behavior, are more congenial to international order than others. Russia hopes that such principles of behavior will be more widely adopted by states, but cognizant that each nation's cultural development is unique, it opposes efforts to promote any one set of ethical values beyond its borders. Hence, the only time that the international community may legitimately appeal to transnational ethical norms is when these are sanctioned by the United Nations. This is a high bar, but, Russia argues, it has been set that way on purpose to avoid abuse. The specific values that Russia sees as more congenial to international order are those shared by Russia's four traditional religious communities: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Their interaction with each other and with the state, Russia argues, demonstrates that religions need not be a source of conflict in the modern world. Indeed, Russian spokesmen have often argued that Western nations could learn a lot from the Russian model. This moral framework has led to four areas of friction with the West. The first regards the nature of the international order. Since the rise of human rights and democracy as foreign policy goals during the 1970s, Western politicians have increasingly argued that in the best of all possible worlds, foreign policy is a reflection of domestic politics. The theory built around this assumption, called democratic peace theory, in its most popular form, is taken to suggest that democracies do not go to war with each other. States that promote democracy are therefore promoting a morally desirable international order, whereas states that object to such efforts are immoral. As their concerns about democracy and human rights have outpaced those of international institutions, Western nations have sought ways around such institutions. One way they have done so is by asserting that Western values are the de facto, if not de jure, international standard. When several Western nations act in concert, therefore, they do not require any explicit United Nations mandate. This has been a second source of considerable friction between Russia and the West. A third source of tension stems from the erosion of traditional religions as the arbiters of morality in the West. For some in the West, it follows that international society must now also find an alternative normative framework. Since the values of individualism, secularism, and modernization led to the rise of the West, according to this line of thinking, they serve as appropriate benchmarks for the rest of humanity. Finally, in today's Russia, the Orthodox Church is closely partnered with the state. It provides intellectual and moral support to many state policies, not, in my opinion, because it has to, but because it wants to. The current moral framework of Russian foreign policy is indeed its view, which the Church promotes because it is convinced that creating such a congenial international order will assist it in its threefold salvific mission: to save individual souls, to save all national cultures that have been baptized into Christ, and to save all mankind. Needless to say, this is as far from the doctrine of separation of church and state as East is from West. The moral contours of the present East-West conflict should now be readily apparent. Russia opposes the adoption of any single set of cultural values as the standard for international behavior. The West counters that Western values are not just a lone cultural standard, but the de facto universal standard. Russia labels this unilateralism and advocates a multipolar world based on pluriculturalism as a better alternative. Pluriculturalism argues that there is an inherent, or as Putin would say, God-given value to diversity among nations. This is distinct from multiculturalism, which values diversity within nations. Russia assigns diversity within nations a lower priority than it does diversity among nations. By contrast, Western states more typically prize diversity within nations, the rights of the individual, whereas among nations they seek to subordinate national cultural differences to standards, such as human rights, that derive from modern Western values.